Thank you for joining us for the Dean Speaker Series mid-March. We know it's a busy time, so it's great that everyone's been able to make it. And I'm sure other folks will join us as time goes on. Today we have Ron Metoyer. Did I get that right? Metoyer, thank you. I was figuring there was an accent in there that I would get wrong. He's a professor at computer science and engineering and associate dean of diversity and faculty development at the College of Engineering at University of Notre Dame. He's a bachelor's in computer science from UCLA and a PhD in computer science from Georgia Tech, where he was a member of the Graphics Virtual Visualization and Usability Center. Ron's primary interest is in HCI with a particular emphasis on on information visualization. He's worked in a variety of areas related to that, including multivariate data visualization, decision-making, and narrative visualizations. Has published a large number of papers, 65 papers over his career, and is a recipient of a career award in 2002. In particular, he's also been very interested and very involved in broadening participation in computing, serving on a variety of groups and steering groups, both locally and nationally in that important area. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ron. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to your talk.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate the introduction. Yeah, I'm really excited to speak today. I'm just glad to be here, and I thank you all for joining the talk. I'm going to talk to you today about some work that I'm doing on two different projects that both look at how we design and employ technology in service to the most vulnerable people in our population, and how we support their access to basic needs. So we're all likely familiar with those basic needs, right? Food, housing, healthcare, employment, things like that. And this audience is likely not one that has struggled consistently with access to any of these needs. However, there is a significant portion of the US population that does struggle to access basic needs on a daily basis. So according to a report from the Urban Institute in 2019, when only considering 5 major supplement programs like SNAP and WIC and Child Care Development Fund, for example, 1 in 5 Americans is served by at least one of these programs. And according to 211.org, the 211 network in the United States responds to more than 20 million requests for help every year. And most of these calls and web chats and text messages and so on are from people who are looking to help meet basic needs like housing and food and transportation. So unfortunately, as I'll discuss today, access to these services is often problematic in many ways, and there's a tremendous opportunity to engage technology in support of this large portion of the population. So get my mouse working here. All right, so today I'm going to discuss 2 projects that we're working on in my lab. I'll spend most of the talk on a very recent project called FINS that we started about a year ago. And that one focuses squarely on food access and how we might engage technology to help with the food access challenge, where we define access with respect to both the information necessary to make good food choice decisions and the actual physical access to food as well. In the second project, which we call CARENet, we'll discuss our investigation into the General Social Services Access Challenge. And we'll look at some design ideas that we've developed in support of improved access. And then I'll conclude by discussing briefly some design lenses that I believe are critical to designing in these domains, and hopefully have plenty of time for Q&A. And if there, I guess we probably can't take questions during the talk. I was going to say, if there are any questions, feel free to stop me, but we'll probably have to do those all at the end of the presentation today. All right, so the starting premise for our work is this realization, or perhaps even an assumption, that in many ways the state-of-the-art technology and innovation are simply not being applied to serve the most vulnerable in our population. This, of course, is not a surprise, right? We live in a society that's driven mostly by those who can pay for innovation. So large tech companies, they make money from people who have money to spend for the most part. And in some cases, we could even argue that innovative tech and these large companies are using these innovative methods to the detriment of the most vulnerable. So we can consider, for example, the use of questionable methods in food production that makes highly processed foods addictive in some cases. In this quote from a 2017 article in the Journal of Ethics, we see the specific concern from the medical perspective, where the new digital divide is no longer just about who has access to tech and who does not, but about how the incentives lead to innovation for the privileged, in this case, people who are actually insured. So in our work, we aim to understand how to leverage technology in support of this group that stands to benefit tremendously from innovation, but are largely ignored due to the financial incentives at play. So I'm going to start by telling you a bit about the Food Information Networks projects. We call it FINS. This project, like many, is the result of an exercise in persistence. I first became interested in food and nutrition many years ago, and really started from a position of high privilege, right? I was really interested in how do we help people understand what is healthy and what is not healthy. And this, of course, is a really loaded question. If you've ever kind of had that discussion with others, you will probably find that there are a lot of different views on and opinions on what is healthy and what is not. I narrowed my focus at the time, looking at how to better communicate nutritional information, including things like ingredients and how to better communicate around the nutrition label. And I was interested in it from a visualization perspective. And this led me to various conversations around campus, and eventually connected me with local community experts here in South Bend, Indiana, where Notre Dame is located. And they were interested in this problem to some degree, right? How to help people make good food choices, but also interested in the often accompanying problem of physical access to healthy food. And so we wrote a proposal in 2019 to the NSF Smart and Connected Communities program. And at that time, the program manager shared it with the National Institute of Food and Agriculture through a joint arrangement that they had. And they liked it, but they didn't fund it. They didn't have the resources at the time. And kind of a funny story that I'll throw in here, that proposal was actually not submitted correctly the first time. And all of you who have written a proposal, hopefully you get them in earlier than I do, but I was half an hour before the deadline, turned it in, drove home, and then I got a call at 5:15 from my pre-award manager saying that she had accidentally rescinded the submission. So needless to say, I was deflated after having worked on this proposal for months. And it actually took me a couple of months to convince NSF to consider the proposal, which they did. Nonetheless, it was rejected that first time. And we reworked the proposal. We submitted it again to the Smart Connected Communities program. It went again through to the National Institutes of Food and Agriculture, and they had the funding at the time and funded the project. And so we started it in the midst of COVID in 2020, and we just finished the first year of work on this project in December. And so you're going to be hearing about some of the very early things we've learned as we've started this work. It is a collaboration of multiple universities, including obviously, of course, Notre Dame, but also the University of Michigan, collaborated in the School of Information there, Purdue. We have many community partners, including the Beacon Community Impact. This is a group that works with multiple organizations in a collaborative health network in South Bend. InFocus, which is a Northern Indiana organization that's dedicated to kind of keeping talent in the area and doing work in the community. Purdue Extension, and the St. Joseph County Health Department. And these are really, really important partners. One that I really want to point out here is the Center for Civic Innovation. And this is a center on campus at Notre Dame that's dedicated to establishing and maintaining community partnerships between Notre Dame and the South Bend community, all in support of innovation within and with the community. So they really facilitate the kind of research that we're doing in this project. Okay, so as I mentioned, we approach the problem from the perspective that healthy eating presents two access challenges: the physical access challenge and the information access challenge. That is access to the information that we need to make good choices. And here, good is not just healthy, but also good meaning it meets other constraints, such as a budget and preferences. Physical access, I'm going to say is fairly straightforward. It's straightforward to understand what we mean by physical access, right? And that is, how do we actually get the food to the people who need it? So our vision in this proposal was to develop a mobile app solution in support of information access to answer questions such as these that we see on the left here, and to explore what we call a hub delivery model in support of physical access. And that requires that we answer several questions around the logistics of a hub. And a hub here is just a location where food gets delivered to. So the idea is that the community members would use the app for essentially planning their meals and their shopping for the week. They would purchase their groceries online, and they would be picked up by a local partner who would go and drive to the grocer, pick up all the food, bring it to the hub location, and that is the central location where the community would go to pick up their groceries. And so that's how we were going to address the physical access side. And so the goals of the project were to study the needs of a community with food access challenges and to develop new technology in support of healthy eating. That technological solution would include algorithmic advances, hopefully, in modeling and recommendation, innovation in how we present food information in a meaningful and useful way, as well as practical the development of the actual mobile app. And from the social science side, we could explore the concept of a hub delivery model and how the technology plus this hub hopefully impact food choices and lead to healthy eating outcomes and actual access to healthy food. Year one that we just finished included mostly the ethnographic work, and that was carried out mostly by our social science team in conjunction with our HCI researchers. And the goal was to identify the barriers to food access and the opportunities for innovation in this space. And so, as you can see, this is an iterative process, one that we're probably all pretty familiar with, where the ethnography is done up front and informs the technology development, which is then brought back to our community for feedback and testing, and then we iterate in this kind of loop. And all of this is being facilitated by our community partners who have the trusted connections to our actual community and the community participants. So, as I said, the first year of the project was largely consumed by this ethnographic study, collecting data and doing some analysis on it. And we carried this out and over the year one, and it led to some interesting insights. At least we think they're interesting, and those are what I'm going to focus on today, as well as some initial design ideas that we've come up with and are experimenting with based on these insights. Okay, so the study was carried out in Census Tract 27 in South Bend, Indiana. It's an area that had been identified in a prior study as a food desert, or more generally, it's an area where the combination of economic constraints, distance to a full service supermarket, and access to transportation make healthy, affordable food just less attainable than it might be for other communities. As you can see here in the upper right, this is the Census Tract 27 in the red box. It's southwest of the University of Notre Dame, so the Notre Dame campus is right here. We've got the Census Tract 27 is located in this red box down here. It's about 3.5 miles from campus. It's on the west side of the St. Joseph River, which is this river here that runs through the middle of South Bend. And that river is somewhat of a socioeconomic divide in South Bend. There's a substantial socioeconomic difference between the neighborhoods over here and the neighborhoods on the east side. And this just shows a close-up view of that Census Tract 27. So the team initially intended to interview about 30 households, broken down as you see here on this slide. Due to the difficulties in recruiting single parents, we actually reduced that number from 12 to 9, and we increased the two-parent households from 6 to 9. The final sample of the data skewed female compared to the demographics of the area, and more towards those who actually had access to and familiarity with technology. The initial interview was designed to elicit basic information about participants' shopping behavior, the contextual factors that inform their dietary habits, meal preparation, and their priorities around their own health and that of their family members. Things like geography, the range of stores frequented relative to the participants' place of residence, access to a vehicle, the role that technology might play in informing their shopping decisions, and any other sources of information about health and nutrition that they relied on were included as potential topics of discussion. The interviews followed a semi-structured format with questions serving as initial prompts, and the interviewer or the participants could then take in any direction that seemed relevant to the study. We followed a standard informed consent process. You received permission to record the interview so we could collect all that data and analyze it later. Following an introduction, the interviews basically started by asking the participants to describe the last time they went shopping, okay? And that was just intended to open up that broader conversation and topics around routines and planning and accessibility and so on. And as noted here, due to COVID, most of these were carried out over Zoom or phone, as well as a few that were done actually in-home interviews. We employed an affinity diagramming method to map our initial findings, to look for connections, look for themes, and to highlight the broader patterns that emerge from the data. And what did we find, right? So this is the part that we're trying to get to. What are the interesting things that we found about how people plan their meal planning? To briefly frame our discovery around this first round, our findings revolved around how people access and approach grocery shopping, and the important considerations that ground their decisions. So at a high level, those decisions are influenced by their forms of financial aid and the cost of food. That's probably pretty obvious. In general, people have developed strategies to really stretch their resources, strategies around substitutions, and engaging their close-knit social ties to address some of the physical access problems and to share information. And we also learned a lot about their perceptions of health. So I'm going to spend time talking about those in the next set of slides here. So I'm going to start by talking about how our participants tend to use assistance for food. So in general, these families piece together aid programs to form the basis of their household grocery needs. And then they purchase what they need to fill the gaps. So they express gratitude for food provided by services like pantries, and those pantries often supply the most expensive of the household needs, like proteins and fresh fruit, produce, and so on, filling those vital gaps that they depend on and they plan around. But the pantries often, believe it or not, offer more fresh items than a family can reasonably consume. And this may be also an artifact of doing the study when COVID hit pretty hard. In some cases, there was a lot of food being given out, and people were unable to effectively store or freeze the food, leading to lots of sharing or donating excess items. This quote illustrates how this particular participant, Don, he pieced together food from the food bank as well as St. Vincent de Paul to combine with his trips to Save a Lot, which is a local discount grocery store in the area. So he puts together these various programs to meet his needs. Our next finding revolves around the kinds of planning that people employ. So we discern two general patterns for how people approach shopping, alongside a third crucial distinction that really upends the whole idea of planning, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Most of our participants exhibited a pretty robust and structured routine that grounded their planning process around strategies for stretching their budgets, as we would expect. The importance of budget to our target community often meant that price did factor overwhelmingly in their considerations, with some exceptions or nuances. So overall, people approach the process from one of two ends. Either people sit down and consider the meals and the recipes that they'd like to prepare, and they use that as a baseline for their planning, or people have a general idea of the stock inventory that they like to keep in the house. And these are the products that are selected for their versatility and their appeal to the family, their particular preferences. And they approach shopping as a means to simply replenish that stock, right? So for them, meal planning primarily happens at the start of meal preparation. And these are the folks that are more likely to do something like have to run to the stores for a missing ingredient in a recipe that they suddenly decided to make, but that they hadn't planned around. A plurality of our participants exhibited some robust planning processes, usually of one of these two types. As I said before, strategies for stretching their budgets. For some, planning is driven less by what is healthy than by how to supplement their existing stock with as few additional items as possible. So, looking into the cabinet, figuring out what you have, and trying to just replenish that, and not thinking as much about the health side of things. The third group is characterized by extreme unpredictability. So this is when planning is often not even done. It's really about what can I get right now to feed my family tonight, given the constraints of what I have in my pocket, how much money I actually have in my pocket right now. So here I'm going to leave these up for a bit for you to read. These are 3 quotes here for the different types of shoppers. So we label these as the recipe-based, the inventory-based, and the emergency-based shoppers. And we have an example quote from each on the slide here. In this particular case, Lynn is a recipe shopper. And she begins by thinking about the meals, right, that she wants to prepare for the week. And she uses that to guide how she makes her list of items and prioritizes her shopping, getting the big ticket items first, like her protein, and saving the side items, in her case, for the food pantry, where she knows she can pretty consistently find those. The second quote here is from Mariella, the inventory shopper. She keeps a running list of the usuals, the things that she normally has in her pantry, and that she knows she can make meals from, that her family will actually eat. And finally, this last quote from Henrietta, we see that she's driven solely by deals and how to stretch her dollar, right? So there's not much planning going on here. It's really looking at what's on sale, what do I have a coupon for, what can I get to feed my family. So it focuses pretty heavily on discounts. So in trying to understand food decision making at the point of purchase, we narrowed down this choice to a confluence of really 3 considerations, not always in this particular order, because of the close synergy between the 3 of them. So people weigh price, they weigh health, and they weigh shelf life in making their final food choices. And each of these things can be are intricately linked, right? For example, shelf life and durability is absolutely critical because people cannot afford to waste food, right? They're spending the little bit of money that they do have on food, and they can't afford to waste it. So they can't have it go bad before they can actually eat it. This often means, spending more time in the store, examining the produce for freshness, checking expiration dates, and things like that. And things that are exacerbated by poor experiences when shopping in their local neighborhood grocers, where frankly, quite often, things like freshness are less than desirable in the stores that they do have in their local neighborhood. So bulk purchasing, for example, a strategy that's employed by some people for cost savings, is not effective for our population that we're looking at in this study. Mostly because they struggled with the distance. So the bulk stores here in our area are on the opposite side of town from this census tract. And it's also a struggle with storage, right? They often have little storage either in freezers or pantry space for these large bulk items. And finally, using it in a timely fashion becomes difficult if it's a fresh product in any way. In this example quote here, Dora illustrates the price versus health trade-off, right? How she will only shop for a week at a time to avoid wasting food. She alludes to her perception of organic as being healthy, and how she can buy organic when there's a sale or a deal, demonstrating this trade-off that she's making between what she perceives as healthy and how much the food actually costs. Another interesting finding that, and really important, I think, for moving forward in this project, is that people are really flexible when it comes to items that they're willing to make substitutions for. So people generally start with a general list of items that they need, but they adjust and they adapt in the store quite often to leverage things like sales or to respond to inventory challenges where something that they want is not available. While people may have specific items in mind, sales and price really drive their final choice for the most part. And so their shopping items often represent categories of foods instead of specific brands or specific products that they're looking for. Okay, so those categories are things like meat or beans, for example. There seems to be a bias towards brand familiarity, but not always brands associated with quality. So people will often go with what they know and what they've purchased before. And people are definitely price savvy and price sensitive, and they know how much things cost and should cost, and where to find the best value. So they're very aware also of when they're being ripped off. So in this quote, we see Bob make a protein substitution in this particular case based purely on what's on sale for the week. When asked to describe what was healthy to them, participants responded in terms of known ingredients. So things that they know are generally considered more healthy, and the level of processing. So in addition to being a property of the food itself, healthy is also a behavior. So it's things like good faith attempts to stick to a particular regimen, with occasional and planned deviations from it. So for example, eating the occasional snack or drinking the occasional soda. So it's both a property of the food, but also around behaviors. In this particular quote, we see that Aaliyah strives to avoid processed foods, and she does so through this particular shopping behavior of trying to stick to the outside of the market, which is something that she learned. It looks like when she had her first son and she went to an education class, I believe it was through WIC. And so again, for her, it's about fresh food, avoiding processed foods. There's a perception that healthy items cost a lot and don't have a long shelf life, which means that you either waste food or you shop more often. That's the perception that people have. Healthy lifestyle, in contrast to an unhealthy one, is considered high maintenance or perceived to be high maintenance for people with limited resources to spend on keeping fresh food items regularly available at their homes. So healthy foods must cost more, and it's harder to eat healthy on a budget, and having food on the table necessitates more grocery store trips. That's the perception. Here, one of the participants, Allison, discusses that perceived trade-off. You see here, she says, so a lot of the time it's hard to buy healthy foods because it's more expensive than it is to buy junk. And she goes on to talk about, the cost of, for example, avocados versus a bag of chips. But there's also, this discussion that needs to be had around, what are you actually getting from those foods, even though it may cost more. Finally, healthy, at least what we learned from our participants, their perception of healthy is about balance, and in particular, the perception that we should be eating a balance of certain things. They would often talk about protein and carbs or starches and vegetables. There's a perception that anything in excess of these or in isolation is unhealthy. So we obviously, eating just protein without your veggies. And in this particular quote from Aaliyah, we see that she aims for proteins, grains, and vegetables and fruits, which actually is very much in line with the My Plate food guidance that we see here at the bottom. And so that's how she goes about trying to maintain balance, is by following that guidance and getting foods in those particular groups. And finally, so where do people learn about food and its health value? This is one of the things that we were interested in learning as well. Everyone has a trusted source of food information, their food guru, who they go to for information about food and healthiness. However, these tend to change over time, often due to circumstances, but in general, Our participants relied on doctors or trained nutritionists, as well as community-based resources, such as those that might be geared towards new mothers, for example. We observed that structured opportunities for delivering nutritional education are often aimed at particular life stages, so the birth of a child, for example. And so people who have less access to critical interventions for healthier eating, if they aren't experiencing these life major changes. So there's those who happen to be going through these changes, there are more opportunities for them to get this kind of expert advice on nutritional information. In this particular example, Rebecca illustrates her reliance on her doctor, but also how a particular life event, in this case, it was her being diagnosed as borderline diabetic, led to new nutrition information that she takes into account when planning her meals. One of the surprising findings that we came across that we didn't expect is that people regularly use multiple sources for their food. And transportation barriers are not as serious as we had originally assumed. This doesn't mean that they aren't challenges, that it isn't difficult for people to physically get to the food locations, but that our participants tend to utilize their relationships to mitigate these physical access challenges. So they utilize their family and friend relationships. So people really are modern day foragers. They piece together their food needs from various stores, and each store has its pros and its cons. This is part of their routine. They start at a primary store. That's the store that satisfies their the most factors that are important to them. And then they move on to secondary stores, which are often less convenient, but they may offer something that the primary store doesn't. It could be sales on certain items. It could be more selection. It could be unique or cultural items. In this case, Francesca stops at multiple stores based primarily on the sales and the deals that they are offering. So what does all of this mean for design of technology in support of healthier eating? We've just begun this phase of the project, so we've just started looking in the last month or so. And so I'm going to show some preliminary ideas that we're kicking around for how to take some of these insights into account in our designs. So in considering the two primary strategies for organizing shopping, the recipe strategy and the inventory-based strategy, and considering the familiar grocery list metaphor, we're hoping to amplify this list building behavior and to augment it with some structure to encourage that healthy balance that people see and value. So in particular, we're going to probably develop this app as a list building tool. It's not a shopping app. And our current approach is to organize the list around the components of MyPlate that you see here. And that is, the goal is there to build an awareness of balance and to encourage consideration of that balance at the meal planning stage, or at the shopping planning stage, I should say. So what might this look like in terms of interaction design? So I'm going to show one option that we're looking at now. And in this particular design idea, the user starts with an empty list. And in order to begin building the list, they can click on the elements of MyPlate. So here's, this is just a rough prototype that we've developed. Here's the MyPlate icon. The user can click on an element, say they clicked on grains. They would see a view like this. We might populate this view with a list of, the most popular grains or eight most common grains that people would often choose. They could also type what they're looking for into the search bar there. And in this particular case, the user has decided to add bread and pasta, so they might end up with this short list like this. And it puts them under the grain section, so it categorizes the food. You can imagine then they add some protein, so clicking on the categories on the MyPlate icon, in this case, the protein section. And after going through this process to add items from each of the elements of MyPlate, the user would eventually have a complete list. So they've added their proteins, and after doing this several times, you've got a complete list, as you see over here. And again, this is a list of generic food items. So these are not specific products. These are just the things that, the food items that people want to get. And they're organized under the My Plate food categories. Now, that solution, may work. We haven't gotten it in front of people yet, but we're a little concerned that it could be too constraining. So we have a second option that we're looking at. And that one allows kind of more free-form list building. So in this design, there's an empty list, and the user can type in here to start adding things to their list. And we see that we still have the My Plate icon here at the bottom. And if you were to click on that list, on that icon, you might get a little more detailed view of what the My Plate categories are and what you have added to your list and where it falls in those categories. So let's say the user added a couple of items, they typed in, bread and pasta, those would fall under grains, and we would, indicate to the user that that section is being filled in to some degree. Here, the user has added, 6 different items. Again, you could click on the icon, you can see how you're filling up the My Plate. And ultimately, in the end, you end in the same place. You've got a full list of food items organized by the My Plate categories. Now, one of the next things that we want to help people do in our design is we want to help them do the complicated things that we identified. So in this case, help them optimize over all of these competing constraints and goals, right? So they're trying to buy as much food as they can, staying under a particular budget. They're trying to eat healthy. In some cases, they might be foraging over several different food producers. And so we want to try and amplify what they do already. We want to help them, forage and make these substitutions and find deals and so on. And, machines are good at optimizing quickly over a set of constraints and objective functions. So we're exploring a back-end optimization approach to generating specific cart items from their generic list, and plus what we know about their context. So we're considering, 2 versions. We call one an opt-in and one an opt-out version of this optimization. And so the idea is that once a user has a full list of generic items that we saw previously, they can proceed in one of 2 ways. One option is to tell the app to select the best products to fulfill that list of items, where best might be defined as, optimized over cost and nutrition with respect to some constraints like avoiding allergens or obviously having one product for each generic item and so on. This might take the form of something like a I'm feeling lucky button. They click on that button and it fills the cart for them. But we're imagining each item would also contain an explanation of some sort, perhaps, icons or color coding. This is just a rough prototype, so we didn't flesh that out, but that might exist somewhere in this section where we indicate to them, price deals or healthiness level, so that people understand why that's being recommended to them. We also envision a way of showing the overall balance of the cart. We have the overall score down here. We might have a health score of some sort and the balance again in the My Plate. Alternatively, the user can select individual generic items such as bread and would be taken to a screen like the one we have on the right here, where they see, what we would recommend, but they also see several other options. Maybe they see what they typically buy, as well as other options that we might be recommending for one reason or another. And so we call this more of an opt-in version, right? This is an opt-out version because if they generate the entire cart, then they would have to say, oh, I don't want, this particular bread, and they would have to shop the alternatives, as opposed to clicking on individual items. So the flow might look something like this. You have your generic set of items. If you click the, again, we probably would want a different name for it, but it's, it's similar to, the feeling lucky button that you might have in a search engine. You click that and it generates this entire list of food items. And from that point, the user would then decide whether they like those or if they wanted to opt out to get a different item. So if they didn't like that bread, they would click on shop alternatives and see this view over here, where they would pick the bread item that they wanted. They could also search for others if what they were looking for is not here. Alternatively, they could click directly on bread over here and go to this screen, right? So that's more of the opt-in version. So we're looking at providing both of these possibilities and seeing what actually resonates with users. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but we're currently working on a linear programming formulation of this optimization problem, where we have generic items like mac and cheese and sour cream and pasta and so on, and we have specific products that you can see along the left that fall into those categories. And if we have things like a nutritional score and a price for each item, then we can formulate a linear programming problem where the objective function here is to maximize the nutritional value, which is y, subject to a set of constraints. And most of those constraints that we see down here ensure that only one item from a category is selected, and make sure we're under a specified budget. That's the final constraint here. So we're currently implementing this optimization formulation, and we'll use it as the starting point for our back-end recommendations. You'll notice that it doesn't recommend right now based on preference or history, but really based on these concrete needs and constraints that our participants would have. This doesn't mean, however, that we couldn't incorporate things like preferences, for example. So we're currently prototyping these initial designs and algorithmic ideas. We'll soon be meeting with our community members to get their thoughts on these ideas and do some informal think aloud experiments with some low fidelity prototypes, and likely move forward with some co-design activities to flesh out ideas or to modify them. We'll be working through the app design and the recommendation algorithms this year, and in year 3, we will finalize the logistics of the delivery hub and prepare the app for actual rolling out in an intervention that we'll do about a little over 3 years into the project. So it's about a 3.5-year project. And in that intervention, the participants will use the app for an 8-week deployment. They'll make purchases, they'll do their planning. Those lists that they generate will result in purchases that happen online. And those groceries will be delivered to a hub location, and we'll hopefully be able to compare their food choices to baseline data that we collect in the first couple of weeks to see if we're impacting the level of healthiness there. We'll also be considering several other research questions, mostly around presentation of food information in the digital environment. For example, how do we support understanding like nutrition labels, which is known to be problematic. As an example here, we're looking at interactive visual narrative food labels. We're moving into the digital environment. A lot of shopping is happening online now, and so we don't have to stick with these static food labels anymore. So in this particular study, we're looking at different ways of presenting the label, and here the user might have put their mouse over this limitations and benefits, and this is a description of how to read the label and understand what kinds of things we should be limiting in red and what kinds of things we should be getting more of in green. And so it would be an interactive label. And so we're looking at ways to design labels and see if we can impact comprehension on food labels. We've also done some modeling of the food network. So we've developed a comprehensive network model consisting of over 500,000 nodes of recipes, ingredients, and users, along with several other pieces of information in each of those nodes. And this network, we've published a couple of papers in this, and this network will form like the basis of our future algorithms for making recommendations, but more specifically for identifying relevant substitutions for people. So I'm going to switch gears a bit and briefly tell you about a second project called CARENet, and then I'll conclude with some brief thoughts on what we've learned from working on these two projects. So this project is aimed at social services access in general. This started when I attended a talk by one of my collaborators, Anne Marie Conrado. And she discussed how she and her students had studied the social services realm, and they were looking specifically at people reintegrating into society from prison. And they found that outdated information is a big problem in the social services domain. And it's true whether they're using, paper and pencil methods or digital methods. Keeping information up to date is just a difficult problem, particularly in a very transient domain where many services come and go quickly. And at the time, I was also working on a project that focused on knowledge management and knowledge transfer. And this was within a large engineering firm. And I realized that what she was saying, I was seeing also in these large firms. We had communities of experts with important information. They were working on deadlines to solve challenging problems, but they rarely had the resources, meaning the time and the money, to support the sharing and recording of all that critical knowledge and updating of that knowledge over time. So we set out to explore this problem in the social services realm, and just to see how can we potentially leverage technology and theories from knowledge management and knowledge transfer to address these specific issues encountered in the social services domain. So again, we took a similar approach. We started with an ethnographic study with community experts, social services navigators, that's what they're often called, and actual end users as well. And we were trying to figure out what the barriers are to access for end users, and what are the barriers to maintenance, keeping information up to date. This was a study with 21 service providers and some end users. Again, a semi-structured interview using a similar analysis process that we used in the FINS project. And we uncovered some things that we think are really interesting and that we used to design a prototype. So I'm going to go through those here briefly. One is that the social services work requires a tremendous amount of trust, and people find services through resources like 211 and social media, but much of it also happens through word of mouth and through provider to provider referrals, meaning a really tight-knit community of providers who are really aware of what each other is doing. As we can see here, people want to speak to someone they trust. From P20, participant 20, someone you know and trust is important when getting information about social services. And referrals happen because everyone knows everyone. And so they trust, they get information from people they trust, and the experts want to refer clients to people that they trust. Second, the update problem is really nuanced in terms of the reasons why information is not updated consistently. In general, it's really just inconvenient. So as an example, service providers, they don't do it often, and they don't really need to do it often, but when it is required, the overhead of remembering the process, where to go, what passwords to use, and simply how to update the information presents, a challenge. Likewise, some services like 211 require that providers fill out pretty convoluted forms, sometimes asking about much more than what actually needs to be updated. This leads to situations like the one here described by P11, where he just quit the process because of all of the questions that were being asked. P14 illustrates the use of personal relationships to help with update issues. So they're talking about reaching out to pantries and other service providers to get them to update their info. So it's a challenging problem. Another recurring theme in the work, the ethnographic work here, was that clients often don't know what services they need outside of their immediate needs. So people come to social services with a very specific need. That's the one that's front of mind for them. And they aren't thinking about all of the other things that they might need, the immediate need and the related needs, as well as orthogonal needs that are often implied by the social determinants of health. So the thing is that we have the technology to help identify those needs. And we know that, for example, Amazon's been doing things like this for a very long time, right? You have a specific need of a razor, but they very quickly tell you what other things you might want to purchase, right? And so again, we developed a prototype. I'm just going to briefly go through here. And we focused on incorporating some of these key findings. One of the things that we found really interesting was that there's this notion of playlists in the social services community. So we see a simple example here of expert curated lists or playlists on the left. So this is in this idea, social services navigators or experts would be able to create these lists of services that are relevant to a topic like domestic violence. And you can imagine if the user clicked on something like support for women, they would be given, a list of the particular services that are relevant and that have been curated by, in this case, Hope Ministries and updated on this particular date. So this idea of playlist can be applied, in many other areas. We're familiar with it from music recommendation systems, but here it can be used for accessing social services. We're focusing on helping users identify those other needs that they might not be thinking about. So we can imagine a user, searching for a service or browsing by clicking through, the browse categories here, and eventually ending up at a service. And we've added this this section here of showing additional resources. So here the user is looking at a particular service, and we're showing what are some other things that you might want to consider that may not be front of mind for you. So let's say they're, in this particular case, they may have been looking for employment services, and here they're being recommended some continuing education services as well. And finally, sharing is critical. So it's important both within the context of a user profile, but also in the case where users may not want to create a profile, which is quite common. People are not necessarily comfortable creating profiles in apps such as this. And so in this case, we'd want to support creation of session lists, the ability to take that list and share it, download it, or print it directly from the app. And finally, while we have not explored the update problem in our prototype, we envision the use of crowdsourcing where community users and expert navigators can flag outdated information. We also envision the use of intelligent agents that can scan the resources to identify potentially stale information and use methods like lightweight push notifications like we see here to ask, is this phone number still an accurate number for your service? And initial feedback has been really positive. I like this quote in particular. This expert navigator said, "This app is building a community within our community and solidifying our knowledge." So that's really what we're after, is helping them kind of solidify this small tight community and make it easy for them to share information amongst each other. So we're excited about this work. This prototype was generated on a seed funding project from the Jessie Val DuPont Fund. And we're in the process of going for a second round of funding where we hope to really explore the social component and support the creation of these local communities of practice. And we really want to look at the update problem and do a deployment. So before I conclude, I just want to briefly talk about some of the lenses that we have used for our design work and that I think have been valuable in how we approach these problems. So the three particular lenses that I've found really useful here are to consider are ability-based design, design justice, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're familiar with ability-based design, it's basically an approach where we focus on what people can do and not on what they can't do. So it's often used when considering physical abilities, and it comes from the access computing community. It rejects this deficit model, right, and seeks instead to really understand what are our participants capable of and to adapt to those. So while we typically think of abilities in terms of physical abilities, I'd like to broaden it to social abilities, socioeconomic abilities, and think about the problem from that perspective. Design justice at its core is about centering people who are often marginalized by design and using collaborative co-design practices to keep those users centered. And so one of the goals in this approach is to really try and amplify what they already do and support them and help them do it better and more effectively, and to challenge structural inequalities as well. And finally, we're probably mostly familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, which is about motivation and what motivates people. People are motivated by physiological basic needs and moving up to these more abstract needs. So as we think about our designs, we want to base our we want to look at our design decisions from these lenses. So if we think about the FENS project, for example, we might look at abilities in terms of what our participants can do, right? They are very good at focusing on sales, leveraging government assistance, relying on that tight community and family network. We can try and amplify the successful practices that they currently have. So list building, or modern day foraging, ride sharing, and substitution shopping, right? And of course, we can look at what motivates them, right? Cost and health and shelf life. And so we attempt to keep these lenses active during our design, ideation, and evaluation phases. And we hope that they will lead to solutions that really serve our community well. So with that, I'd like to stop and acknowledge the many people who work on these projects, including all of my faculty collaborators that are shown here. We've got a number of graduate students shown in the top row here, as well as our community partners shown in the bottom here. These are the folks who really get us connected to the many social services and food services in the local community. And finally, a number of undergraduates who have worked on the project throughout the academic year, as well as some summer intern teams. And so with that, I'll acknowledge the sponsors for this work and say thank you and open it up to questions. Hopefully we have some time for those.
We have a little bit of time, and just so everyone knows, we actually have scheduled some time to talk with Ron in a different Zoom meeting where you can actually see each other. So Sarah had just put the link for that in the chat. So if you can join us for that, that would be great. Again, that'll be anytime over the next hour. Well, however it goes.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't leave much time there.
That's okay. But we did have one question that I think it cuts across a whole bunch of different questions that people had. And it really relates to kind of the connection between food and culture and identity and other aspects. So I think somebody else also asked for a version of this with gender. But and so they were kind of wondering how that connection between food and eating and culture and identity showed up in your findings, or would be something reflected in your design. So maybe you comment on that before we go.
I mean, it certainly, food is a very cultural thing, right? We saw it in some cases in the foraging and why people forage. So in those cases where they have very cultural foods that they might want to eat, it may require that they go to certain locations to get that food. So we certainly see that. I think the identity part is really interesting as well. And we've thought a bit about how do we try and maintain some of that, I guess, the social aspects of shopping and going to a place like a store, especially like a local cultural store. That's a challenging one to solve. It's one that we're thinking about and considering, but it certainly does come up.
Again, just so we keep everybody on schedule, or keep on everybody's schedule, I think we'll wrap it up there. But thank you very much. It was a great talk in terms of kind of describing how the methods and the work that you've done in other areas and that many people at the college use can be brought to bear on a problem that they might not have thought about. So thank you very much for that and joining us. And again, everyone, if you'd like to join us, there's the link in chat to another Zoom room. And we'll be there and we'll be able to talk with Ron in more detail there.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.